why I really like working with vets specifically. And I, at least so far, have not expanded beyond vets, is because there's a whole lot of layers to dealing with the professional aspects of being a working parent and specifically being a clinical medicine working person. But then there's also all the other little pieces that are more like tendencies. Like we tend to have perfectionistic tendencies. We tend to be a little bit of black and white thinkers, and we tend to wait until we're older to have babies. And we tend to have high stress lifestyles, which put us at a little bit of a higher risk for having some health concerns during our pregnancies. And then this whole thing tends to make us more likely to have postpartum complications, both health and mental. And because this is the world that I'm steeped in, and because I have a lot of tools that I bring to the table, I just feel like I'm just very well suited.
Hi guys, and welcome to the House Call Vet Cafe podcast. I'm Dr. Eve Harrison. I'm a full-time integrative concierge house call veterinarian in Los Angeles, and I help other vets to build their unique mobile practices on their terms. This podcast is for and by house call and mobile veterinarians, so it is meant to give our community a platform to connect, to share our stories, to lift each other up, and to support each other. Most of us work solo as lone wolves, right? So for me, it's been really powerful to be able to physically hear the voices of my colleagues from all over the world and to get a chance to feel that we truly are part of a community of very real other human beings who get it. While you may be alone in that little bubble of your own vehicle when you're on the road seeing patients, I welcome you to join our community by tuning into our own podcast when you're on your way to your next house call. Whether you're a super experienced house call vet with 30 years of experience, you're a brand new prospective house call vet just looking to get started, or you're house call curious, there will be something for you in this podcast. Each episode, you will hear interviews from other mobile veterinarians just like yourself who are doing unique and innovative things, vets who are sharing their stories, their struggles and challenges, and you can also look forward to hearing valuable information and perspectives from specialists and experts outside of our micro niche. And finally, if becoming a house call veterinarian is something that you've been thinking about exploring, or you're looking for some extra support getting your own mobile practice to feel more profitable and sustainable for you, check out the information in the show notes about my course and our above and beyond supportive private community for members only, plus our monthly group coaching sessions within the House Call Vet Academy. You can also check out my free public Facebook group, which is also called the House Call Vet Cafe, the same name as this podcast, and which is a warm and cozy community for mobile vets to support each other in professional and personal development, in creative entrepreneurship, and in friendship. So thank you guys for spending time with me today. Let's dive into the episode.
Hey everyone, we have an amazing guest today that I've been really excited about speaking with for a while. And I think you guys will be really excited to hear this episode too. I'm like really getting ahead of myself here because it's like I'm already planning out like a 2-part, 3-part episode. This is going to be so good. So anyway, who do we have with us? We have the amazing Dr. Emily Yunker, DVM, CVMRT, CVH Doula, who is a vet and a mom and a whole lot more. She works full-time in rehabilitation and integrative medicine while still sometimes working in ER medicine. She's also the Veterinarian Doula, a role that has her working with moms who are vets everywhere from fertility and conception planning through those first rough weeks back at work, and especially in the weeks immediately before and after birth. The connecting strand in everything she does is holistic wellness, consideration for the whole being within the context of their environment and their relationships. It works for professionals, families, animals, workplaces, politics, and everything. Welcome, Emily. You're a phenomenal human being, and we've been following each other for a while, and I'm just so excited that we're finally having this conversation, and I wanted to welcome you to the show.
Thanks, Eve. I'm so excited to be here. Like, I've done quite a few interviews, but there's very few where I feel like almost any topic is on the table, and like, let's just see where this goes.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go deep. We're going to ask anything and everything. And this is going to be a good one, guys. Like, get ready. So to start with, can you tell me what is your favorite snack to eat in the car when you're on the way either to work with a veterinarian in the doula context or when you're on the way to doing rehab and integrative work? What is your snack of choice?
Yeah. So I'm really spoiled. My husband is a really passionate traditional cook, and he makes me breakfast every morning, and I take it with me. And it's always a little bit of a surprise what's going to be in there, but there's usually backyard chicken eggs that have been boiled and some kind of fruit that I can eat with my fingers. So berries or a handful of nuts or something like that. And so, like, my breakfast is really lovely, and it's definitely my favorite thing I eat in the car.
God, that is divine. And it's like a breakfast made with love by your husband and like you have chickens. Oh, I didn't even know you had backyard
Okay,
chicken.
so they're actually not my chickens. They are my neighbor's chickens, to be clear.
Beautiful.
Someday they will.
Mini backyard chickens. That is the sweetest thing ever. Oh my God, that is like the magical start to the morning. Highly envious. Thank you for sharing that. That's absolutely divine. Can you tell me a little bit about how you started your unique journey of working with veterinary moms as a doula, and also how you weave all of this holistic work into your practice and your practice as a doula as well? And like, what was your journey like to get there? This is so unique. And like on that note, like I've gotten to know a lot of end of life doulas these days, but it's been a while since I don't know that I've ever had, a friendship with a birth doula or like a beginning of life doula, and how interesting that is in our veterinary space because of how often it is we have the opposite, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've got like 5 side tangents. So I'm going to try to like make this make sense. The word doula just is like a Greek derivation of the word slave, and it applied specifically to a female helper within a family structure. And it was used kind of starting in the late 70s was when it was first used by, it was actually a midwife, but she was teaching other people how to show up for women in birth. And she used the term doula. And by the time we got to the 90s, it was pretty darn well established as a paid profession where you could be a professional birth attendant who was not a baby catcher. And that is actually really distinct. And then there was a long time where this existed as a thing, but it was like, do you pay for somebody for this or not? And who needs this person and who doesn't? And what's the difference between a doula and a midwife? And finally, we got to like, I don't know, 2015 or something. And it seems like something kind of clicked into place. And suddenly people were like, oh, I think I understand the role of this person. And at the time, it was still pretty specific to birth, someone who would physically be present in the birthing room that was hired independently by the woman who was not a medical professional. So they were there to meet her physical and emotional needs, not her medical needs. Now, it didn't take long after that. And in some of these things, they were concurrently happening just at different levels. The term doula and the role of the doula already expanded beyond that. Even before it was really recognized in the general public, it was already expanding well beyond a labor support person. It had to do with showing up for a woman in the postpartum phase, because frankly, that is in a lot of situations harder than the birth. And most people don't realize that. And then the combination of showing up for somebody in the postpartum and being there at the birth almost immediately led to the understanding of a need for a bereavement doula. So this is surrounding child loss.
Oh my God, how
Yeah.
close they are. Wow. Wow.
And then that extended into what we call a full spectrum doula, who is present at any point during a pregnancy when there's a loss, whether that loss is an intentional choice and that person is choosing to end that, or whether that is an unplanned, unforeseen event. And then it sort of skips some stuff in the middle. But because of the existence of a full spectrum doula and a bereavement doula, it very much just became, well, of course, it makes sense to have this at the other end of life too, for the older people, adults who are crossing the other threshold out the other side. And there's just so much overlap that at first they were the same people. They were people who trained as birth doulas and full spectrum doulas who then felt a calling towards end of life care and palliative care and things like that. And it's only been more recently, like really just the last less than a decade, I think, that you could actually specifically take trainings to be a death doula. That was a separate path than being a birth doula. So they've just been intertwined the whole time. And that's because there's such an intersection here. this transformation, this passageway that happens, and this intersection between all these like medical and professional and legal parts of life with like the emotional needs of the person and the family. And it's so complicated. And so having someone who's literally there just to be like, I will help smooth the edges on this. And it is my profession to help you smooth the edges on this feels very obvious, I think, to anybody through either one of those things. But, it's interesting because if you haven't been through either one of those things, you haven't had someone really close to you go through the passageway of death, or you haven't frankly been through the birth experience and the early parenting experience, you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And that is definitely going full circle. That is definitely how I got into this. Okay. So I had two paths simultaneously happening. One of them was intentional. The other one was just the product of life, right? So I wanted to be a veterinarian from the time I was a little child. I actually eventually, even this is a parenting story, eventually I remembered the exact impetus that started it off. It took me a while to remember what it was, though. I just remember the family story being that when I was like 3 or 4, I walked up to my mom and I was like, is there such thing as a doctor for animals? Because that is what I want to be. And she's like, yes, that is called a veterinarian. And I was like, that's what I'm going to be.
You wanted to be it before you even knew it existed. That's
Yes.
so adorable and beautiful.
Yes. And so I just did. Like, literally, there was never really anything else I considered. And even when like they make you think about those things, so what if that doesn't work out? Like most people who say they want to be vets don't actually become vets. So what else do you want to be? And I'd be sort of like, I mean, I guess I could go into academia and just study those same things. That's just what I want to do. I don't know what to say. And so I, made up answers like, sure, I'll get a PhD in research biology or something. But no, I just always wanted to be a vet. And then at the same time, I lived in a household with a mom who had a chronic disease. My mother has fibromyalgia. And that actually, I didn't know this until later either, was a postpartum complication for her, like it is for many women. Most autoimmune conditions start sometime in the postpartum period. And it did for her. And I didn't know that until I was an adult, but it did. She was working 2 jobs and she had 3 kids. And she hit burnout big time. And in her particular case, that manifested as fibromyalgia and chronic health conditions forever. And so during my really formative growing up years, my mom was seeking out ways to feel better and still be a functional human while still working and raising kids with some mixed success. I'll be honest. It wasn't like she fixed it. But so she was taking supplements and she was going to chiropractors and she was having massages. And at the same time, so I was exposed to the world of like integrative health in a very practical, lived experience kind of way. And also simultaneously with that, and there's a lot of overlap in these worlds, my mom was a natural birth junkie. Like she had all of us unmedicated. She was a labor and delivery nurse and then chose to have unmedicated births and then became a Bradley childbirth instructor, which is an unmedicated birth methodology. And so she was teaching birthing classes in our living room when I was a child. And then as I grew up, I got to babysit those kids and their kind of like naturally minded child rearing sensibilities. And so that's the world I was like steeped in. And a lot of them were integrative health practitioners. They were in that lifestyle. This is what they were doing. So there was just all these things that just sort of weaved together. And then my uncle was on a farm. And so I was exposed to animals birthing without assistance. I did not actually see a C-section until I was a veterinarian. And so to me, there weren't like separate things happening. This was just my life.
They were just like the cycle of life. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Yes. And so it's not like, it's interesting because you have some people who are into complementary, alternative, integrative medicine types who are actually pretty like anti-scientific medicine. And a lot of time, I mean, I'll just say, I think a lot of that comes from trauma. I think when we get really like pushing away of something, most of the time that comes from some kind of trauma. And because I did not come from a background of medical trauma, I never had this like rejection of anything. So I was just like, well, I just want all of it.
Wonderful.
Want all of the options.
I love that. Yeah.
And that's just sort of how I approach everything in life. So when I'm looking at a dog in front of me with a problem, I don't necessarily only have just my tools, like a skin problem, for instance. It's a classic. I don't only have my immunosuppressives and my antibiotics and my hypoallergenic diet, I also have my topicals and my herbs and my mushrooms and my gut microbiome management. So like, I just don't feel like I have to choose. I'm just going to do whatever is the right thing for that patient in that moment. And then the same thing applies to my kid. Like, yes, my tendency is more towards a little bit of like an attachment parenting, natural parenting kind of approach. But like, if that's not working, then we'll do something different. And then the same thing applies to my doula work. Like, yes, I come from a lineage of unmedicated birthers, and I was also an unmedicated birther. But that does not mean that I think that everybody should have an unmedicated birth. I think that you take care of the person that is in front of you. What is their circumstances? What is their set of values? What tools can we apply to get what we want? And then with veterinarians, and this is why I really like working with vets specifically, and I, at least so far, have not expanded beyond vets, is because there's a whole lot of layers to dealing with the professional aspects of being a working parent and specifically being a clinical medicine working person. But then there's also all the other little pieces that are more like tendencies. Like we tend to have perfectionistic tendencies, and we tend to be a little bit of black and white thinkers. And we tend to wait until we're older to have babies. And we tend to have high stress lifestyles, which put us at a little bit of a higher risk for having some health concerns during our pregnancies. And then this whole thing tends to make us more likely to have postpartum complications, both health and mental. And because this is the world that I'm steeped in, and because I have a lot of tools that I bring to the table, I just feel like I'm just very well suited for it. And so it was sort of an accident that I realized that I had 2 babies. And I mean, I'm not going to say I had it figured out. Like my oldest was only like 5. So it's not like I was like seasoned here, but like, I was like, okay, I think we're figuring this out, right? We're figuring it out. And then COVID happened and my husband became a stay-at-home dad and I was working full time in an ER. And we know what ER was like in COVID.
Mhm.
And and
Thank you for this, by the way.
and there were no babysitters and there were no daycares and there were no schools, and we had to cancel my 5-year-old second half of his kindergarten year, which was absolutely heartbreaking because that's like the mother's tea and like the cute little graduation gowns, and like it was really heartbreaking. And so I had this really bizarre juxtaposition of like, I would come home to our funny little house in the woods, which really does kind of look like a little herbalist cottage in the woods, like it's kind of stereotypical, to our garden that we had planted and like my kids playing in the dirt. And my little toddler at the time was like really into like picking flowers. And so she would like bring me teeny tiny purple flowers that she'd like picked in the yard, and this sort of like idyllic protected world, which I know this is not something everybody can relate to in COVID. This was not everybody's life, but this was my little protected bubble. And then I would like go out into the world, like to go grocery shopping and to go to the ER. And it was like a zombie apocalypse. Like it was insane. It was insane. And so there was this just weird divide. And that divide resulted in, frankly, me making some poor decisions and entirely misunderstanding my body's signals. And I ended up pregnant. That's the short version of that. Yay. Hey, so now you're having a COVID baby. Woo!
This is number 3.
This was number 3. And that was such a journey. And I will say that I think anybody who had a baby in 2020, 2021, and maybe even some people from 2022 probably do actually have capital T trauma and some level of PTSD. So far, I haven't met anybody who came out of it who did not. Maybe there's some really lovely people out there who things just fell into line for them, but I don't. It's really unusual. I think pretty much everybody who had a baby at that time has some trauma around it. And I was not an exception to that. And that's because we actually have enough research on this now to know that the lack of social support was incredibly detrimental, both with health outcomes and mental health outcomes, and potentially even some developmental outcomes for our littlest babies under certain circumstances, the most at risk. So having gone through that, and it was my 3rd, so I know what it was like with baby number 1 and baby number 2. I know I can see the difference in how I felt in my pregnancies and my postpartum with those 2 versus baby number 3. And in some ways, it was very intimate. I made the decision to just not interface very much with the human medical system at that time, based upon what options I had in my area. So, I mean, I had some blood work and an ultrasound and stuff like that, and some Dopplers. But really, I did not do conventional obstetrical care during that time because of the weird availability issues and the options I had. So we took an alternative route, had a home birth. It was lovely. And I mean, I think that was the right call under the circumstances. I don't second guess that choice, but we did have a medical event happen around the time of the birth. My son did what's called, which is not even a name, delayed transition. That's just what they call it. It's not even, they don't even like have like explanations for this. There's not diagnostics for it. It's basically just like, they're not quite breathing the way you expect them to. And they're kind of okay, but not really. And so even though there wasn't really anything diagnosably wrong with him, we ended up in the NICU for a couple days during COVID, which was a nightmare. And because I hadn't been a patient in the hospital, I didn't have a hospital room, and you really couldn't easily leave and come back. So I just lived in the hospital for a couple days. They did give me a room, which was really lovely. Like a midwife advocated for me so that I had a parent's room in the NICU, which is a thing. If you don't know that's a thing, you should ask for it. I didn't know it was a thing. And so I was physically in the hospital, but like I spent something like 21 hours a day sitting upright in a chair in the NICU, starting the day I had a baby and going for 2 days, which was really not ideal. Just be clear. Even when you have an uncomplicated vaginal birth, that's just not ideal. And I didn't have anybody looking after me. So there was no nurses taking my blood pressure. There was no one refilling my water bottle. There was no one asking me if I needed pain meds because I wasn't a patient. I was basically on my own. And so when we came back home from the hospital and we were both given a, clean bill of health and told to just proceed with life, I knew that I was going to need a little bit more support than that. And I had already set myself up for about as supported as a postpartum as I could pull off during that time. I really couldn't hire a professional. Sadly, that just wasn't really a thing. But I did have my parents come into town, and then my husband's mom came into town after that. And don't get me wrong, we do not have perfect family dynamics, but it was better than nothing. And my husband, I mentioned he was already the stay-at-home parent, so he was home the whole time. And so I was never alone with my children ever for weeks on end. And I didn't need to be alone in the middle of the night. Now, I actually was, because by this point I was a third-time parent and I knew how to handle all that stuff. And I didn't really feel like I needed middle of the night support, but I had it if I wanted it. And I also had, I already had my postpartum journal set up. I had my postpartum Facebook support group set up. I had my best friend, who's an MD, as a side note, regularly checking in with me. And she'd been there right up to the day I gave birth. But unfortunately, we had guessed wrong on when baby would arrive. And so she wasn't there for the dramatic part. Of course, she wasn't there for the dramatic part. And so I had set myself up for success as much as I could. And boy, did that pay off. I did not have a perinatal mood disorder. And I'm not saying that to be like, yeah, I'm a rock star, because there's only so much you can prevent and there's only so much you can plan for. But we do know, we have an incredible amount of research. It's not even subtle, overwhelming research that having support during postpartum dramatically decreases the incidence and severity of postpartum mood disorders. And so I just did that. And, I think we came through it pretty smoothly. During that time, I actually had an incredibly creative explosion, which is actually pretty common. Women who have pretty supported postpartums, you have so much brain remodeling going on, which we might get into in a little bit. But your brain is dramatically remodeling during that time because of the enormous hormonal, basically washing that is happening. And sometimes that can result in all kinds of problems. But when it's really well supported and or you have good luck, it is actually an opportunity to heal some deeply embedded traumas in your life. It's a unique opportunity to heal previous life traumas. And we don't talk about that much because that puts even more pressure on the postpartum time. But I actually got to experience that, and that I had this incredible creative energy. And I basically came up with the entire concept for the Veterinarian Doula. I wrote a bunch of blogs. I created an outline for a course. I redid our entire finances and the way we approach our budget. I read a whole bunch of books. And then, and this was a fairly short postpartum. I didn't have 6 months. I had 8 weeks. I had tried for 12, but then my car broke down right in the middle of it. And now I had an unexpected NICU bill and I had to buy a new car while we had no income coming in. So I ended up having to go back to work well before I wanted to. And yet I still had this really transformative healing experience. And so basically what I realized was that the reason my outcomes were good is because I knew what the hell I was doing. And I was like, wouldn't it be amazing if other people knew what they were doing? So what do I wish I had known the first time around that I know now? And how can I somehow make this common knowledge so that people are going into parenting for the first time or potentially even the second time, understanding what kind of support they need and how to get it? And I mean, that's really why the veterinarian doula exists as what I do. So that is my journey. Not
Wow.
the short version. That's the long version.
Oh, I didn't ask for the short version. I wanted the long version. And that was fantastic. I'm sort of like speechless, like what string to pull from this, like where to go from here, because it's like, it's beautiful. There's so much wisdom in there. And
Hi, my name is Jonathan Lau. I'm the founder of O3 Vets. One of the challenges of being a mobile veterinarian is that you have a more limited toolbox to draw from. At O3 Vets, we put a powerful tool into your toolbox by providing ozone therapy equipment designed specifically to help the mobile veterinarian treat those tough cases. Ozone works as a redox molecule to help decrease inflammation and improve cellular communication. This has an incredibly beneficial effect on a variety of conditions, as demonstrated through the hundreds of scientific studies available. If you would like to join thousands of veterinarians who've experienced the power of ozone therapy, you can visit o3vets.com or call us at 517-925-8148. If you mention this ad, you'll get access to our online training course with the purchase of your ozone equipment.
and like, thank you for sharing about the trauma, capital T trauma, like you said, that about, the kind of the perinatal experience during 2020 and the pandemic. I think that needs to be validated for a lot of people. And I think the fact that you said it, like, I hope our listeners feel like you're not alone. Like, this was a traumatic experience. The pandemic itself was traumatic, but let alone having a baby and having to make decisions about, do I vaccinate while I'm pregnant with this vaccine that has been out for 5 seconds? Or do I isolate? Do I go into the hospital? Like, is the NICU okay? Am I okay to be in the NICU? Is my baby going to be okay? What if I get COVID during like then the lack of availability and just the whole system shutting down basically and not being on top of its shit, if you will. So I'm really, really glad that you mentioned that, because I think that's really important for us to discuss and for people to have validated and heard if their experience is anything like that. And then I also find it incredibly fascinating what you said about this sort of neuroplasticity that happens in the perinatal or like immediately after birth of the brain being rewired. And it reminded me quite a bit of some of the work that I've been doing lately in the psychedelic healing space. Of course, always in legal environments and legal contexts. But there's a concept, I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, specifically with like psilocybin is the context that I've kind of come into this sort of like exposure to this context and the healing of trauma work that you can do while your brain is so open and changing and everything is just different, and you can revisit these old traumas and maybe actually heal them in that space. But there's a concept called REBUS, REBUS. It's like not a real acronym. It stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. So it's like not a true acronym. It's like a abbreviated. Basically what it means is like your brain is so neuroplastic that the ideas that you held on to that, like, for example, the world is not a safe place, you might, or some concept that you've internalized from a childhood trauma or any trauma in your life, that you might be holding on to a story that now affects your future decisions about how you move through the world, right? With psychedelic medicines, mushrooms and, peyote and cactus and all these kind of indigenous medicines that have been used by indigenous people and are now kind of coming a little bit more into the mainstream of like almost like mental health and healing for depression and like PTSD and trauma and all this stuff. So there's this rebus, like where your brain just is rewiring and you have access to old memories without necessarily the same stories. And you can play with these stories and revisit traumas without the same baggage and then come out the other end having this memory that no longer has a hold on you the way it did, this sort of like grip of trauma and some thought that you have in your mind, you can't go there or you can't think that thought, or if you do, it goes into a whole like cascade of insanity. And,
Wow.
it's very, very interesting. I had no idea that there was a similar mental experience or emotional experience with the neuroplasticity around birth. And it makes complete sense. Why wouldn't there be? Why wouldn't there be? So, I mean, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing about that. And I think it's actually it's relevant for kind of my next question, which is, so a lot of people come to house call practice specifically for the flexibility. They want agency over their lives in a professional capacity. They want control over their time. They want the freedom to be with their families, to parent how they want, to be there for their children, to make decisions that are not dictated by some corporate boss or some middleman who says what your schedule has to be, or it guilt trips you for taking the time you need for your own health. So people feel, in general, I would say 75% of the people that come to me seeking to start a house call practice or maybe to revamp the practice, it's because they are either moving into motherhood or parenthood, or they are already parents and looking to be able to like live the life that they want and have agency in their parenthood, their motherhood, and their stewardship for their family. And so my question for you is, I know you're kind of on the brink of that decision. We had a conversation a while back about maybe starting some sort of concierge practice, maybe house call, maybe not, maybe telemedicine. Like you had some really, really cool ideas and we had a conversation about it. And I'm not asking that you have any sort of like answer or verdict that you come up with, but what I think is maybe really interesting for our listeners to hear is it's like what these like almost the pros and cons, like what's in your head as you're on the brink, like pregnant with this possible decision. And, given that so many people are in the peri-birth, peri-motherhood period where their brains might actually be more neuroplastic, more creative, more open to a huge change, like starting a practice or bringing like really novel, heartfelt ideas into what the practice might look like around the parenthood. I was wondering if you could just sort of speak and if you felt comfortable to share some of your thought processes around these issues.
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say I had no idea that like 75% of people who come to you are sort of in this intersection of motherhood and veterinary medicine. I did not realize that. That makes so much sense to me, though. So much sense, because on the flip side of that, I would say 75% of my clients are either house call or relief, not working as full-time associates. And that is actually in stark contrast to the general population of associate veterinarians who are still having babies. So I think that there is a subset here who are realizing that something needs to change and they're thinking about that intersection. And then there's another set of people who are entirely blind to the possibilities. It hasn't occurred to them yet.
Yeah.
And those people are, I mean, gosh, I'm like really overgeneralizing here, but I mean, I think this is real. And I think that your audience will understand where I'm going with this. There are people who are pretty strongly bought into the system, whatever the system is, the academic system, the medical system, the economic system, the political system. And they get really good about playing the system to win. Or you don't get very good at it, and then they kind of feel screwed by the system. And veterinarians, in order to get through our academic process, are pretty damn good at playing the system. Like otherwise we wouldn't have been able to pull this off. And some of us are aware that we're playing in the system, even if we don't really buy into the system. And other people are really fully bought in. And the people who are never really bought in, they're just like, well, I have to have the DVM to do what I need to do. So that's what I'm going to do. Those people remain pretty open to possibilities. They're the ones who are more likely to pursue entrepreneurship. They're the ones who are more comfortable with risk taking by nature. And they are kind of always looking for what's the next best thing. They never really feel like they're settled ever. And then you have the other group of people who really thought that what they wanted was associateship and then potentially ownership, but maybe even they're not even sure if they want to do ownership. They just want to be a vet. They want to be a vet in the way that they imagined being a vet, and that is what they want. And statistically, that group will either find a practice that works for them, or they will get really incredibly burned out and have major problems. And the recent survey data coming out about retaining veterinary professionals really shows that for associates, this is different if you're a tech or a CSR or a practice manager, but for associates, what they need is to feel like they have opportunity for advancement and they need flexibility. And you know what? Most of them are not particularly wanting to leave their jobs. They like the predictability of their jobs. They need to be able to have their personal life work. Okay. So then there's the population that apparently you and I work with. And they are kind of like, this is not the best way of doing this. And I think I would like to find a better way of doing this. And I am okay with finding people who are experts at this and investing in them. And so these are people who, I mean, frankly, who are willing to pay for us, and not everybody is. And so I think we have a particular subpopulation of people who want more and are open to possibilities instead of just trying to work within the system, which interestingly, I did not know was going to be who I was working with. I thought that I was going to be working with people in their late 20s and early 30s who were associates in large practices. And that is mentally what I had prepared for. And that is what all my marketing was geared towards. And that is not who is showing up. And I've literally had to like step back and be like, okay, I need to rethink something. And that's great. I mean, but it is interesting. And so it's actually by working with my clients that obviously I'm kind of a out of the box thinker, but I've always kind of assumed that the best path for me was being an associate. The reason I thought that, which I think a lot of moms can relate to, is because I knew I wanted to be a mom and I knew that was a priority for me. And I couldn't envision, and potentially I still can't envision, what it takes to be a practice owner and a mom at the same time. I really struggle with trying to figure out how you give both of them the attention you want and that they really need. And I don't have that modeled well for me. I don't know people who I think have done it the way I would do it. So it's a little hard for me to picture it. So I definitely went into corporate practice right out of vet school, intentionally, on purpose. Like that was a choice I made, even though I'd done all of my shadowing and all of my like high school and college time had been in private practice. I also knew I did not want that. I was like, you people are burned out. You have no lives. You work 80 hours a week. I do not want that. I want to clock out at the end of the day and go home. And so I signed up for corporate practice and I picked the one that at the time had the best benefits package that actually included some short-term disability insurance, which not very many did at that time. I mean, it hasn't been that long. It's only been 10 years, 11 years, but that sure feels like a long time ago. The industry has changed a lot in that time. And I still worked a lot of hours, but like I was done when I was done. I wasn't on call. I wasn't called in for extra shifts, and I had good benefits. And I also had good mentorship. I will say that's highly independent. That's highly dependent upon where you work. The particular location, I was very choosy about it. And I chose a 5-doctor practice that had 2 very experienced doctors and a pretty decently good medical director and a really solid practice manager. And I did not have to like be entirely on my own for a surgery for months. I got really good at dentals because everybody around me was really good at dentals. I had techs who were highly supportive. And even though I had major surgery anxiety, they would like put on the calming music and they would like lay out all this stuff for me. And they're like, it's going to be okay, Dr. Yunker. Did you go potty first? You know, like they were so good to me. And I don't have any regrets about that first place that I worked. Unfortunately, I've also seen the other side of corporate practice. The second location I worked, I was 6 months pregnant when I started there. And they pretty much made it clear from the very beginning that they didn't really like the idea of babies at all. And that they were not going to really accommodate my need for pumping breaks. And so I basically ended up in a situation where I could either take lunch or pump. And I wasn't allowed to stay late to write notes, but I also wasn't allowed to write notes while I was on my breaks. Like they were basically just hedging me further and further into areas of discomfort until it was very clear that there was literally no way to make it work anymore. And this was within the same company, just a different location with a different mindset. which also confirms the AHA data that it all comes down to like who your team is and who your support structures are. And it's not about what name is on the building. And so then it was very clear that while it looked good on paper, that if it was that easy to game the system, if it was that easy for people to decide that they didn't want me there and to just find ways of working it so that I was gone, then I wasn't really safer there than anywhere else. So at that point, I was not really interested in working in corporate practice anymore. So I went back to private ownership, which has its own levels of risks. I mean, like if you don't jive with the team there, it's just as bad and they potentially have worse benefits, which was exactly what happened. ER work. So there were good teams and bad teams. The turnover rate was high. Sometimes it was great. Sometimes it wasn't. The benefits package, it was a much smaller practice, was not great. I mean, they tried, but like there's only so much they could really do from a benefits standpoint. So like with baby number 2, I had no paid leave of any kind, and that sucked real bad. And we got creative with it. You know, I tried to bank as much vacation time as I could, and theoretically I could work additional shifts to bank up more time. But the thing was, I was pregnant. I didn't want to work more shifts while I'm tired. I mean, I'm already exhausted. So I'm going to try to work more shifts just so I could take a break after the baby arrives. Like this, just does not work. So, but they tried, and I'm still with that practice. So it's not like it wasn't the only determining factor, but it sure would be nice to have more benefits. And by the time baby number 3 came around, we have short-term disability available, and that was nice. So I banked some vacation time because nobody was traveling during COVID anyway. And I had my short-term disability, and that went nice. And I was coming to and from a practice that was really supportive of me as an individual and offered a whole lot of flexibility. And I will say is about as family friendly as you can get without a daycare on site. That would be even better, maybe someday. But so like, I think that for me, if I felt like I had to choose between flexibility and the risks of being on my own, I would probably choose the flexibility and being on my own. But in my case, I've been lucky enough to find a practice that allows me to have quite a bit of flexibility without needing to go out on my own. And so that is a harder call for me than it is a lot of people. And I found a practice that lets me do a lot of the integrative things that I want to do because I'm in a rehab-y world. And rehab is by nature integrative. And then I just add in even more things to some of my additional stuff I do. And so like, I don't feel like I have to leave to get what I want for the most part, except as you and I have discussed, integrative medicine has to have a completely different way of coming up with like a fee structure. Like it's just not even the same. And the challenge that I'm having right now with getting paid for my time in integrative practice is real. It's real. And so that's the part where I'm like, I honestly don't know if I can make this work with the kind of overhead that I have as an associate in a brick and mortar. Like, I don't know if I can make this work. And so there is a growing tension. If I want to imagine the practice I want, I may have to drop having a building. And as someone who's always had a building, that feels really big. So that's sort of an insight as to like the process going on in my head and like why that call is easier for some people than others, I think, and then why it's hard for some people compared to others. Like, what kind of medicine do you want to practice? What do you need to practice it? And how do you balance that with what kind of income you need or want to make and what kind of life you have outside of work? How do you find the blend for those things? And it's just very individual. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing some of your thought process. And again, I think this is going to be really validating to a lot of people that I know are up against similar decisions, whether, they can make parenting work, put their whole heart into parenting and their whole heart into their practice, and whether they can do this without a brick and mortar, whether they can go out on their own and support themselves. And I mean, these are exactly the questions that we should be asking ourselves when we make a decision to start a practice. And I value your voice and your concerns and your well-balanced pros and cons list. I think it's all completely valid. I'm obviously very biased, and I'm privy to seeing a lot of parents beautifully balance their parenting with their practice. But I mean, it is such a uniquely individual decision to make. And I think every outcome is valid. And I mean, there's financial decisions that weigh in, there's the team that you have supporting you now, whether you have a practice that is not like burning you out so bad that you need to get out immediately, and whether you feel like that's good enough. I mean, it's a really beautiful place to be, where you're not like on the hot plate where you're like, oh, I got to make a decision right this second. Like, you have a little bit of like luxury to sort of like, what do I, and like, that's a beautiful place to make these decisions from. And thank you for sharing that decision process. And like I said, we're not going to like come up with an answer right now.
And let's see, career therapy live.
Yeah. As much as I'm feeling a craving to do that, we're not gonna. But yeah, I'm just really grateful. And I know a lot of people are going to see themselves in your story and your thought process. And I think there's like a lot of inherent value that you shared that. And again, I want to validate you and say that a lot of your concerns are like, this is the heart of it. This is the heart of the decision-making process. And you're doing it. Whatever you decide to do, I'm proud of you for thinking these thoughts and for sharing them with us. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us for part 1 with Dr. Emily Yunker. Our conversation got so juicy and so heart-based that it was just like not something that we could end after 30 to 40 minutes. So I hope you guys will join us for parts 2 and 3. And those should be really, really awesome. And I can't wait to see you there.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the House Call Vet Cafe. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit the subscribe or follow button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never have to miss an episode. This podcast is made specifically for you, so don't be shy if you'd like to reach out and let me know your thoughts on this episode. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook as The House Call Vet Academy, where I also share more valuable content. If you're interested in learning more about consulting for house call vets or the House Call Vet Academy online course and community, please click on the link in the show notes. Have an amazing rest of your day, and I can't wait for you to join us for our next episode of the House Call Vet Cafe.